Why don't you want me anymore? She asked, standing there like nothing had changed, like the past few months hadn't quietly rewritten everything I thought I knew about us. And I remember thinking in that exact moment that the question itself wasn't the problem, it was how easily she said it, like the answer wasn't already sitting between us, heavy and undeniable, like she hadn't been the one who put it there in the first place. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my life I believed in simple things: show up, work hard, take care of your family, build something that lasts, the kind of belief you don't question because it's been working just fine. 12 years of marriage will do that to you. It builds a rhythm so steady you stop listening for anything offbeat. Olivia and I had that rhythm. Or at least I thought we did. A house just outside Columbus. A quiet street where nothing really happens. Neighbors who wave, weekends that blur into each other with grocery runs and yard work and the occasional dinner out. It wasn't flashy, but it was ours, and I was proud of that. I used to come home every night around 6, same routine, keys on the counter, jacket over the chair, the smell of whatever she decided to cook filling the kitchen, and she used to smile when I walked in, not a big smile, not dramatic, just enough to make the whole place feel like it was still ours. That was before things started changing, and the truth is, when something breaks in a marriage like this, it doesn't shatter all at once, it shifts, slowly, quietly, almost politely. Olivia started coming home later, said work was picking up, new responsibilities, more pressure. I didn't question it. I told myself that's what partners do: they trust, they give space, they don't jump to conclusions over small things. But the small things kept stacking, her phone face down on the table. Conversations that felt shorter, thinner, like someone had taken a pair of scissors to them and cut out the parts that mattered. I'd ask about her day and get answers that sounded complete but felt empty, like reading a report instead of hearing a story. And then there were the moments that didn't fit anywhere, the kind you notice but can't explain, like the way she'd pause half a second too long before answering a simple question, or how her laugh changed when she was texting someone, lighter, sharper, like it belonged to a different version of her I wasn't invited to anymore. I told myself I was overthinking it, that people change, that marriages go through phases, that not every silence means something is wrong. And for a while, that was enough to keep me steady, enough to keep me from asking the one question I probably should have asked a long time ago. But standing there that night, looking at her, hearing her ask me why I didn't want her anymore, I realized something I hadn't let myself admit before. This wasn't about what I wanted, it was about what had already been taken, and the part that hurt the most wasn't the loss, it was how long it took me to see it clearly. I used to believe that if something was wrong in a marriage, you would feel it like a storm rolling in, loud and impossible to ignore. But what I learned instead was that sometimes it feels more like a slow drop in temperature, subtle enough that you convince yourself you are imagining it, and by the time you realize how cold it has gotten, you are already standing in the middle of it, alone. I remember one night in particular, a Tuesday. Nothing special about it. I got home at the usual time. The sun still hanging low over the rooftops, casting that soft orange light through the kitchen window, and the house was quiet, too quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels like something is missing. Her car was not in the driveway, which was not unusual anymore, so I told myself the same story I had been telling for weeks. She is working late, she is busy, this is what successful people do. I set my keys down, poured myself a glass of water, and stood there for a second longer than I should have, listening to nothing, the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking. Sounds that used to fade into the background now felt louder, like they were trying to fill a space that used to belong to her. I checked my phone, no message, no update, just silence, and it was that silence that started to feel different, not empty, but intentional, like it had been placed there on purpose. I made dinner for one, something simple, chicken and rice, the kind of meal you make when you are not really hungry but you know you should eat, and I sat at the table where we used to sit together. 2 plates, 2 glasses, conversations that used to stretch into the night, now reduced to a single chair and the sound of a fork against ceramic. I kept telling myself this was temporary, that things would shift back, that whatever phase we were in would pass, because that is what you do when you have built a life with someone, you protect the idea of it, even when the reality starts slipping, Later that night she came home, the front door opening just past 9, heels against hardwood, a familiar sound that somehow felt distant. I looked up from the couch. She smiled, quick, practice. Like she had already decided how the moment would go before she stepped inside. "Long day," she said, dropping her bag on the counter, and I nodded, not because I believed it, but because it was easier than asking questions I was not ready to hear the answers to. She moved through the house like everything was normal, like nothing had changed, but I started noticing the details I used to miss. The way she avoided eye contact just a little too often, the way her phone never left her hand. The way her energy shifted when it lit up with a notification. Subtle things, small things, but they added up. And then there was the moment that stayed with me, the one I could not explain away. She stepped out onto the back patio to take a call, said it was work, but something in her voice did not match the word, softer, lighter, almost careful. I was not trying to listen, but when you live in the same house, walls are not as thick as people think, and I caught a piece of it, just a sentence, quiet but clear enough. "He has no idea," followed by a laugh that did not belong to me, and that was it. No name, no context, just that one line hanging in the air like something unfinished. I sat there, staring at the television without seeing it, replaying those 4 words over and over again, because sometimes it is not what you hear, it is what you feel underneath it, and in that moment, something inside me shifted, not anger, not yet, just a quiet understanding that whatever was happening, it was already further along than I had allowed myself to believe, and for the first time, I stopped telling myself everything was fine. And started asking a different question, not what is wrong with us, but how long has this been going on without me noticing. I did not confront her that night, and that was the part of the story most people would not understand, because the natural reaction is to demand answers, to push, to force the truth into the open, but I had already crossed a line in my head. The moment I heard those words, something inside me chose a different path, not louder, not faster, just quieter, sharper, more deliberate. I went to bed that night like nothing had changed. Lay beside her while she scrolled through her phone, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes, and I realized I was looking at someone I knew in detail but no longer understood, her breathing steady, calm, like she had nothing to hide, and maybe that was the part that unsettled me the most, not the possibility of betrayal, but the ease of it, the comfort, the way it had folded itself into our routine without making a sound. The next morning I woke up at 6, same as always. Made coffee, stood by the kitchen window watching the early traffic roll past. And for the first time in years I did not feel the urge to wake her up. I let her sleep, or at least I pretended she was sleeping, because I had started to notice that her nights were not always what they seemed, small details, like the way her phone would light up at hours when no one should be texting, or how she would shift slightly, just enough to check it without thinking I noticed, but I noticed everything now. And once you start seeing things clearly, it becomes impossible to go back. I left for work that morning with a different kind of focus, not distracted, not emotional, just aware, like I had stepped into a version of my life where I needed to pay attention to every detail. My job had always been about precision, about catching small errors before they turned into bigger problems, and I realized I was applying the same mindset to my own marriage. I started with the obvious, patterns, timing, behavior, not because I wanted to prove something, but because I needed to understand what I was standing in the middle of. Over the next few days I kept everything the same on the surface, same conversations, same routines, same calm tone, but underneath that, I was watching, listening, connecting pieces that had been scattered for months, maybe longer. Her schedule started making less sense the more I looked at it, meetings that ran late but never seemed to produce any real results, work events that she mentioned in passing but never described in detail, and always the phone, always present, always just out of reach, like a barrier I was not supposed to cross. And I did not cross it, not yet, because I did not need to, not when the truth was already leaking through in other ways. One afternoon I came home earlier than expected, a meeting cancelled, nothing dramatic, just an extra hour I had not planned for, and as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something that did not belong, not a car, not anything obvious, just a subtle shift, the back gate slightly open, something Olivia was always careful about. I stepped inside, the house quiet again. But different this time, not empty, just paused, like something had been interrupted. I stood there for a second, listening, the same way I had days before, and that was when I heard movement upstairs, quick, controlled, followed by silence, and in that silence, I felt it again, that same understanding settling deeper. This was not confusion anymore, this was confirmation building itself piece by piece, and instead of reacting, instead of calling out her name or rushing up those stairs, I did something else. I stepped back, closed the door softly, and walked away, because at that point, I was no longer trying to catch her, I was letting her reveal herself completely. And there is a difference between those two things. One is driven by emotion, the other by certainty, and I was done acting without certainty. There is a point when suspicion stops feeling like a question and starts settling into something heavier, something that does not need confirmation to exist, and that is where I found myself in the days after that afternoon. I did not change my routine, I did not confront her, I did not even ask indirect questions, because by then I understood something most people learn too late. Once the truth starts showing itself, all you have to do is give it space and it will come out on its own. So I gave it space. I went to work, came home at the usual time, made the same small talk, nodded at the same surface level answers, but internally everything had shifted. I was no longer reacting to her words, I was observing her behavior. The difference is subtle, but it changes everything. One evening she sat across from me at the dinner table, scrolling through her phone while barely touching her food. And I watched the way her expression changed when a message came through, not dramatic, not obvious, just a slight softening around the eyes, a quick inhale, the kind of reaction you cannot fake because it happens before you think. And in that moment I realized something that hit harder than any direct evidence. She was emotionally somewhere else. Wherever that message came from, that was where her attention lived now, not here, not with me. And once you see that, it is impossible to unsee it. I started noticing patterns I had ignored before. How she would angle her phone away just enough, how she would step into another room to answer certain calls, how her explanations became more structured, more prepared, like she had rehearsed them in advance. It was not sloppy, it was careful, and that told me this was not new, this had been building for a while, maybe longer than I wanted to admit. I thought back to the past year, the trips she insisted were necessary. The weekends she seemed distant even when she was physically present, the conversations that slowly lost depth, until they became nothing more than updates and logistics, and it all started connecting in a way that felt almost clinical, like solving a problem you did not realize you were working on until the answer appeared. But the moment that changed everything did not come from something big, it came from something small, almost insignificant on the surface. It was a Saturday morning, no alarms, no work, just quiet sunlight filling the living room. She was in the kitchen making coffee, her phone left on the counter, and for a second, just a second, I considered picking it up. Not out of desperation, but out of curiosity, to confirm what I already knew, but I did not. Because deep down I realized I did not need to see the messages to understand what they would say. The real truth was already clear in how she carried herself, in how she looked at me, or rather how she no longer did. I walked into the kitchen, poured my coffee, and stood beside her, close enough to feel the distance that had grown between us. And that was when it hit me fully, not as a shock, not as anger, but as something quieter, more final. I was no longer part of her world in the way I used to be. Whatever we had built together was no longer something she was protecting, and the most unsettling part was how normal everything still looked from the outside. Two people standing in the same kitchen, sharing the same space, but living completely different realities. And in that moment, I stopped thinking about whether she was betraying me, and started understanding that in many ways she already had. Long before I allowed myself to see it, and once that understanding settles in, it does not create noise, it creates silence, the kind of silence that does not ask questions anymore, because it already knows the answer. There is a strange kind of clarity that comes after you stop hoping things will go back to the way they were. It is not relief, it is not even acceptance, it is just a steady understanding that what you thought you had is no longer there. And once I reached that point, I started looking at our past differently, not through nostalgia, but through contrast, I found myself remembering the early years of our marriage, not in a dramatic way. Just small moments, the kind that used to feel ordinary. Sunday mornings with coffee on the back porch, road trips where we did not need a destination, late-night conversations that stretched longer than they should have because neither of us wanted them to end, and I realized those moments were not just memories, they were evidence of something real that had existed, something she had once protected the same way I did, which made the present feel even more distant, because you cannot lose something like that overnight, it does not disappear. It gets replaced slowly, piece by piece, until one day you look around and realize you are standing in the same place but everything inside it has changed. I started noticing how little of that original connection remained, how our conversations had turned into transactions, how her attention felt borrowed instead of given, and the more I paid attention, the more I saw that this was not just about her pulling away, it was about her investing somewhere else, time, energy, emotion. All of it redirected, and that is when the weight of it really settled in, not as anger, but as a quiet kind of loss, because betrayal is not always loud, sometimes it is measured in the absence of things that used to be there, the missing questions, the lack of interest, the way someone stops seeing you even when they are standing right in front of you. One night I was sitting in the living room while she was upstairs, the house quiet except for the faint sound of movement above me. And I realized I could no longer remember the last time she had asked me something real. Not about schedules or errands, but about me, how I was doing, what I was thinking, anything that required more than a surface-level response, and that realization hit differently, because it meant the distance was not just physical or situational, it was emotional, intentional, and already complete on her side. I stood up, walked through the house, and stopped at the hallway where our photos were lined up. Years of moments captured in frames, vacations, holidays, milestones, all the proof of a life built together. And I looked at them longer than I had in years, not because I was searching for something, but because I was recognizing what they represented, not what we had now, but what we used to be, and the contrast between those images and the reality I was living in became impossible to ignore. It was not just that she had changed, it was that she had already moved on in ways I had not allowed myself to admit, and once that truth settled in, something inside me shifted again, not breaking, not collapsing, just adjusting, like a part of me finally aligned with reality instead of memory. And in that alignment, I felt something unexpected, not pain, not even anger, but distance. The same kind of distance I had been noticing in her, only now it was mine, and it was not forced, it was not a reaction, it was a natural response to understanding that whatever we had shared, whatever had once belonged to us, was no longer being held by both of us. And once something is only held by one person, it is already gone. The shift did not happen all at once, it settled in quietly, the way everything else had. But this time it was different because it was happening inside me, not around me. I stopped waiting for her to come back to the version of herself I remembered. I stopped expecting things to feel normal again, and instead I started adjusting to what was actually in front of me. And what was in front of me was someone who had already stepped outside of what we had built together, not physically in an obvious way, but emotionally, mentally, in ways that mattered more than anything else. I began to notice how easy it became to be around her without feeling anything, not anger, not frustration, just a quiet neutrality that replaced everything I used to feel, and that neutrality was not something I forced, it was something that grew naturally the more I accepted the truth. One evening she sat next to me on the couch. Closer than she had in weeks, maybe months, and for a moment it almost felt familiar, like muscle memory, the way our bodies knew how to exist in the same space. But the feeling was gone, completely gone, and that was when I understood something that took me longer than it should have. Connection is not just about proximity, it is about presence, and she was no longer present in this marriage, and because of that, I was starting to withdraw mine as well, not in a dramatic way, not with statements or arguments, just in small, almost invisible decisions. I stopped sharing things about my day unless she asked, and she rarely did. I stopped trying to fill the silence, I stopped reaching for conversations that led nowhere, and the more I pulled back, the more I noticed something unexpected. She did not immediately notice, not in the way I thought she would. There was no confrontation, no sudden concern, just a subtle shift in her behavior, like she could sense something had changed but could not quite define it, and that was when the dynamic between us started to reverse in a way that felt almost inevitable. She began to initiate small things again, casual questions, light touches, attempts to reconnect on the surface. But it all felt delayed, like a reaction instead of intention, and the timing of it made everything clearer. Because it did not come from a place of genuine presence, it came from noticing the absence I had created, and that difference mattered. It changed how I saw every interaction after that. Every smile, every question, every attempt to close the distance between us felt less like connection and more like maintenance, like she was trying to hold on to something without fully understanding why it was slipping, and the more she tried in those small, surface-level ways, the more I realized how deep the real disconnect had become. Because you cannot rebuild something meaningful with gestures alone, not when the foundation underneath it has already been given away, and I did not need to confirm anything at that point. I did not need proof or confrontation or explanation. I already had what I needed, not in the form of evidence, but in the form of clarity, the kind that settles in your chest and does not leave, and once that clarity is there, it changes how you move, how you speak, how you look at the person standing in front of you, because you are no longer seeing who they were. You are seeing exactly who they are now, and for the first time in a long time, I stopped asking myself what I should do next, and started understanding that whatever came next was no longer about saving something. It was about deciding how to walk away from what had already been lost. By the time I stopped trying to fix what was already broken, something else began to take its place, not anger, not revenge, just the kind of quiet control that I had not felt in a long time. And that control came from knowing exactly where I stood, even if she did not. The dynamic between us continued to shift in subtle ways. The more I pulled back, the more she seemed to lean in, not in a dramatic or emotional way, but through small attempts to reconnect, questions that sounded casual but carried a different tone underneath, touches that lingered a second longer than before, conversations that felt slightly more intentional, and I could see it clearly now. She was starting to notice the distance, not the cause of it, but the effect, and that is the part people often miss. When someone begins to feel you slipping away, their reaction is not always rooted in understanding, sometimes it is rooted in discomfort. In the unfamiliar feeling of losing control over something they assumed would always be there. One night she asked if I wanted to go out to dinner, just the two of us, something we had not done in months, and I agreed without hesitation. Not because I believed it would change anything, but because I wanted to see how far this shift had gone. We sat across from each other in a small restaurant downtown, the kind of place we used to enjoy, soft lighting, quiet music. The kind of environment that used to make conversations flow easily, but this time it felt different. Not tense, not awkward, just distant, like two people performing a version of something that used to be real. She smiled more than usual, asked questions she had not asked in a long time, laughed at things that were not particularly funny, and I watched it all without reacting the way I used to, because I understood what it was now, not a return, but a response. She was trying to reconnect with something she felt slipping. But the timing of it made everything clear, because genuine connection does not come back on command. It does not reappear just because one person notices the absence. It either exists or it does not, and in that moment, sitting across from her, I realized that whatever we were doing now was not the same thing we had before. It was an attempt to recreate it without addressing what had replaced it, and that is why it felt hollow. She reached across the table at one point, her hand brushing against mine, a gesture that used to feel natural, automatic, but this time it felt like something else entirely. Like a question she was not asking out loud, and I did not pull away, but I did not respond either. I let the moment sit there between us, unresolved, because that was the truth of where we were, unresolved, unspoken, but understood on my side in a way it was not on hers, and I could see it in her eyes for just a second, a flicker of confusion, maybe even concern, because she was no longer getting the same reactions from me, the same reassurance, the same presence. And that was when I realized something important. She was starting to feel what I had been feeling for months. The distance, the uncertainty, the quiet shift in connection, only now it was directed back at her, and the difference was, I had already moved through it, I had already accepted what it meant, while she was just beginning to notice it, and that imbalance created a new kind of tension, one that did not rely on arguments or confrontation, but on silence, on absence, on the space between what was said and what was not. And in that space, everything that needed to be understood was already there, waiting for her to catch up to it. The shift became impossible for her to ignore after that night, not because I said anything, but because I stopped saying everything I used to, the small reassurances, the rhythm of attention, the quiet ways I used to hold the space between us together without even thinking about it. All of that was gone now, and in its place was something she could not quite define but could definitely feel. It showed up in the way she watched me more closely. The way her questions carried a little more weight, like she was searching for something in my answers that she could not find anymore, and for the first time in a long time, I saw uncertainty in her, not guilt, not confession, just uncertainty, like she was realizing that something she had taken for granted was no longer guaranteed. One evening she stood in the doorway of the bedroom while I was getting ready for bed, leaning slightly against the frame, arms crossed, her expression somewhere between casual and cautious, and she asked a simple question, something that should have felt normal, but did not. She asked if everything was okay with me, and I looked at her for a moment, longer than necessary before answering, not because I did not know what to say, but because I knew exactly what I was choosing not to say. I told her I was fine, calm, steady, the same tone I had used for years, but this time it carried a different meaning, one she could not fully interpret, and that was the moment I saw it clearly. She was no longer certain of her position in my life, the same way I had once been uncertain of mine in hers, and that reversal changed everything. Over the next few days her behavior shifted again, more direct this time, less subtle. She started initiating conversations that felt almost out of place compared to the distance that had been there for so long, asking about my day, suggesting we spend more time together, even making small efforts to reconnect physically in ways that stayed within normal boundaries but carried an intention behind them, and I did not reject any of it. But I did not respond the way I used to either. I stayed present but distant, engaged but detached. And that difference created a tension that neither of us acknowledged out loud. It was in that tension that everything reached its peak, not through an argument, not through a confrontation, but through a moment that felt almost ordinary on the surface. She stood in front of me one night, close enough that I could see the uncertainty in her eyes clearly, and she asked the question again, not casually this time, but with something deeper underneath it, something closer to realization. She asked why I did not want her anymore. And for a second the room felt completely still, not heavy, not dramatic, just quiet in a way that made everything sharper. I looked at her, really. Looked at her, not the version I remembered, not the version I used to protect, but the person standing in front of me now, and I realized that this was the moment everything had been building toward, not a confrontation, but a conclusion, and when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, controlled, the same way it had been through all of this. But the meaning behind it was no longer hidden. I told her the truth, not loudly, not with anger, just clearly, and in that clarity was everything she had not allowed herself to see until now, and the silence that followed said more than any argument ever could, because in that silence, she finally understood what had been lost, and more importantly, why. She did not respond right away, and that was the part that stayed with me more than anything else, not the words I had said, but the silence that followed, because in that silence you could feel everything shifting, everything settling into place in a way that no longer needed explanation. She looked at me like she was trying to find something familiar, something she could hold on to, but there was nothing there anymore. Not in the way she expected, not in the way it used to be, and I could see. The moment it finally connected for her, not as a sudden realization, but as something slower, heavier, like a weight dropping into her understanding piece by piece. She was not losing me in that moment, she had already lost me, she was just now becoming aware of it, and that difference mattered more than anything, because it meant this was not something that could be fixed with a conversation or a promise or even regret. It was something that had already been replaced over time, quietly, consistently, until there was nothing left to repair. She tried to say something, started a sentence and stopped halfway through, like the words did not fit anymore, like they belonged to a version of us that no longer existed, and I did not rush to fill that space. I let it stay exactly as it was, because for the first time, the silence between us was honest, not forced, not avoided, just real. And in that honesty there was a kind of closure that did not require agreement or resolution, just recognition. I stepped past her then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just calmly, the same way I had moved through everything up to that point, and that small movement said more than anything else could have, because it showed her what she had not allowed herself to see before, that I was no longer standing still waiting for her to come back. I had already started moving forward, even if it did not look like it on the surface. The next few days unfolded without confrontation, without long conversations, without the kind of emotional scenes people expect when something like this happens. Instead, it was quiet, deliberate, almost methodical. We moved around each other in the same space, but with a new understanding neither of us needed to explain. She became more aware, more present, but it felt different now, not like connection, more like realization. Like someone walking through a place they used to know well and finally noticing how much it has changed, and I stayed consistent. Calm, steady, not out of detachment, but out of clarity, because once you see things for what they are, there is no reason to react the way you would have before. The final moment did not come with a decision or an announcement, it came with a feeling, a quiet certainty that there was nothing left tying me to what we had been, and I understood something in that moment that I had not fully grasped before. When someone gives away what was once shared, they are not just losing it, they are changing it into something that cannot be reclaimed, not in the same form, not with the same meaning, and that is why what I felt was not anger, it was absence, the absence of what used to be mine to hold, to protect, to believe in, and once that absence settles in, it does not leave space for confusion or doubt, it leaves space for something else entirely, something quieter, stronger, more grounded. The ability to walk away without needing anything from the person you are leaving behind, not an apology, not an explanation, not even acknowledgement, because the truth has already done all the work for you, and in the end, that truth was enough to carry me forward without looking back.